So let's talk a little bit about air rights and what are they and how to value them. Air rights for a normal residential property are actually baked into the price, because when people buy a home, they know they can extend the home back, they know they can go vertically, and they can add additional stories. But how do you value air rights for a residential apartment that's part of a multi-unit development? And traditionally, with most of these apartment developments or unit developments, the actual owner's corporation, which controls the common area, they have all the air rights traditionally, both over the common area, and also they own the outer skin of the building. So generally the outer walls are controlled and owned by the owner's corporation. So they control things like signage, the roof of the development. So for example, if a telecommunication company wants to install antennas and satellite dishes on the roof, they will generally work with the owner's corporation, and they'll enter into a lease agreement. They'll be able to use the roof space. So generally the owner's corporation controls the outer wall and the outer skin. But in some instances, like the properties that I've just shown you, the proprietors of these apartments and units actually own the outer skin, and they have air rights, so the ability to build upwards. So in this situation, how does a buyer of these apartments, how do they determine, firstly, if they do have the air rights, and secondly, if they do, what's the value of that to the buyer if they decide to buy this particular unit? So there is an answer to that, but it's a technical answer, and it requires a little bit of due diligence, and also there's a lot of hypothetical assumptions that go into determining what the value are, but I'll just go through the steps now. It's very, very important to do a SWOT analysis, no different to when you buy a business. So if you have a look at the properties here next door, this factory's been sold. This is a late 1800s, beautiful looking commercial building, and the factories adjoining that have recently been sold as well. So what does that mean? It means that these properties are ripe for development. So it's a little bit of a risk. And the risk is that we may have compromised the views from the converted warehouse apartment. You can actually see the city, and you can see a lot of docklands, and there is a risk that those views can be compromised through future development potential. So when we do a SWOT analysis, we're looking at the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats of the surrounding build form. So often you hear property spookers and so-called experts, keyboard warriors, talking about, the Hot 100 and all these hot places to buy, but really real estate's very much a property to property focus, and all decisions need to be made looking at one property at a time. So it's all great to be talking about postcodes and to be talking about medians and averages, but as far as I'm concerned, when we buy real estate, we're buying one property, and that one property, we've got to be looking at all the different trade-offs, all the different advantages and disadvantages. The advantages with this particular property are obviously that you've got air rights, the outside skin is owned by the proprietor, there's underground car parking, it's in a great location, it really feels like a warehouse conversion. But in terms of the optics moving forward and the risks in terms of city views and views of the docklands, it is a risk that we need to take into consideration, and then we need to factor that into our price now. So when we think about how we determine the residual value of the air rights for a unit or an apartment, think about how that's also determined for a home. With a home, the air rights are baked into the price, generally speaking. So when someone's buying a home, they're assuming they can use it as a home, or they're assuming there's an alternative use if they want to convert it into a unit development or townhouse development, or maybe build some apartments. Generally speaking, most people, when they buy a home, they buy it for residential purposes as a standalone home, but often investors are purchasing things for rental purposes with an eye to the future in terms of how do they add value and improve the home. But generally, when we're valuing a home and we're considering air rights, what we're looking at is a hypothetical development. So hypothetically, we're looking at the end value, what we may be able to build on this site. And what we do is we deduct all the different and various costs to get back to a project-related site value. And generally, when that project-related site value is higher than the alternative use as a home, then it makes sense for us to buy the property as a home and to benefit from the air rights or the ability to develop. In the same way, when you look at a unit or an apartment, what we're thinking about, what we should be thinking about if we've got air rights is what's the added value of adding additional floor space. So for example, the apartment that I'm looking at the moment in South Melbourne, that's approximately 150 square meters. So what we might want to think about is, what if we could add another 150 square meters on top of that apartment, or let's just say 100 square meters. So we've got to think about what's the added value of 100 square meters on this apartment. So it goes from 150 to 250. So once we determine hypothetically how much additional floor area we can add onto this apartment, and let's assume it's 100 square meters, we need to do some market analysis to work out what's the added value of having that extra 100 square meters. And let's assume it's $10,000 a meter or $1 million in added value. So from that $1 million, we need to then deduct all our costs. And those costs will include things like construction costs, contingencies, professional fees, marketing and sales costs, etc. Profit to the owner or the developer, assuming they were doing this in order to sell and make a profit. And then we get down to the residual value, which is after, so $1 million less all those costs. What we're left with, if we're left with any money at all, is the residual. Let's assume we're left with $50,000. So we start with $1 million, we deduct all our costs, and we're left with then $50,000. That $50,000 is potentially the value of the air rights to the developer or the investor. In the same way, if you start with $1 million and you deduct all your costs, and the costs are actually greater than $1 million, then it doesn't make sense to apply any value at all to the air rights, because there's a negative impact on adding an additional 100 square meters. So that's, in a very rough way, that's how we would look at air rights and how we would value air rights for an apartment. It's important to remember that most of so air rights are a hypothetical thing. So unless you have the planning permits, the building permits, and all the costs laid out, you're hypothetically assuming all these costs and determining the value of these air rights. And finally, it's important to understand that banks don't lend against air rights, they lend against market value. And unless you can prove that there's a difference in the market between units and apartments with air rights versus ones that don't have air rights, then it's going to be very difficult to be able to explain to a bank that this particular unit has this additional value, which is hypothetical. However, if this unit development comes with planning permits, building permits, costings, etc., and it's provided to a bank, the bank can actually fund a hypothetical construction loan, because they'll be able to do what's called a before and after valuation. So the before valuation is what it's worth now, the after valuation is what it's worth on completion, and so long as the LVR component is okay during the construction period, you can potentially get a construction loan, provided all the ducks line up. So it is a technical process, and it's important, if you go down this path, to get professional advice from a professional CPV qualified valuer or an advocate who understands how to value their rights.